Let me congratulate the organizers and all those attending this important conference today on the convening of this important event. I feel privileged to have been invited to speak again at this annual Understanding China International event. And we do so in a year that is significant for China and the world, because we are confronting huge global challenges that require global solutions, from the cooperation we need on climate change and addressing global financial instability, to the cooperation now required to eradicate global poverty, protectionism, nuclear proliferation, and pandemics. And so I will speak as requested on how we can work together to meet and master global problems that require global solutions. In everything I say, my eyes are fixed on a better future for all. For I will argue that politicians who try to build the present in the image of the past will miss out entirely on the great challenges of the future. Let me first of all recognize and acknowledge the achievement of China, which has over the last half century moved from low-income country to middle-income country and is now on course to be a high-income country. For decades, you've been achieving continuously high growth rates that are unparalleled in the history of the world economy. I was a finance minister for 10 years, but with growth rates in China never below 4% and often above 10%, your growth rates became the envy of Western finance ministers who for many years have had to report either recessions or growth rates as low as 1 or 2%. Even more important, perhaps, China has taken 700 million men, women, and children out of poverty. Again, achievement over 4 decades that is unparalleled in human history. And I also speak as a special envoy for the United Nations on global education. You have, over these decades, moved education from being a promise that guaranteed only a fraction of children primary and secondary education to one where far more than 90% have that advantage and benefit. I visited China many times over the years, including to the Olympics held so successfully by China in 2008. And I've met your presidents and prime ministers regularly. I was part as prime minister of a China-UK dialogue on human rights, and I hope that this can also continue. But the question I want to address today is, how do we find a better way for each of us to live and work together? We have been influenced by the words of your own president that we must build a community of interests across the world. We must, as he has said in his own words, build a world in which there is between countries an accumulation of converging interests that create a solid foundation of common interests upon which we can build communities of common interests. And one of our conference organizers who I've worked with over many years, Zhen Yijian, has said that we must, on the basis of evolving global political and economic dynamics, forego what he calls overzealous defenses of narrow national self-interest at the expense of what we need is a wider view of how national self-interest in an enlightened basis and global interests can move forward in harmony. Our aim, as he said, should be to transcend the differences in ideology and social systems and discard the parochial attitude of closing the doors to others. So I welcome, as a signal of this, desire to work together despite many differences on individual issues. The announcement in the last few days at the Glasgow Environmental Conference, COP26, that America and China will now work together to promote a global response to climate change. And the 2 leading carbon emitters, responsible for almost half of the world's carbon emissions, coming together to taking the lead in saying the world must work in unity to combat climate change is very important. And this must be the basis for joint working between the countries of the world on all issues of importance. Now, when I met President Xi on his last visit to London, he told me that China was determined to avoid 2 traps. The middle income trap that too many countries in Latin America, Asia have fallen into, which prevented countries becoming high income countries and thus prevented the wider diffusion of global prosperity. And he wanted to prevent the Thucydides trap, the danger of a rising power, not only threatening the established power, but also ending up in conflict with it. And so the question in international relations is whether we can find the basis for future cooperation and prevent a descent in what some people would call a future of one world, but 2 systems. I know we can do better. Let us be clear. There are 3 ways of managing the world that have to be rejected. The old way, the Washington Consensus, which was an economic ideology that prioritized liberalization, deregulation, privatization, and low inflation. The Washington Consensus that is no longer supported even in Washington. There's another possible future that I call PPN, protectionist, populist nationalism. But that has brought tariffs, walls, and isolationism, and a defensive form of nationalism that could so easily morph into an aggressive, us versus them nationalism that subdivides the world into silos, America first, Russia first, China first, India first, and so on, even when we all have to face and suffer the same diseases, the same recessions, and are looking for similar responses. So we surely all know the only way forward is not the Washington consensus, not nationalism, not a future of one world, two systems, but responsible cooperation, building a society of states. And I want to discuss an agenda of cooperation that identifies areas where there are common interests and where by intensifying collaboration, we can manage also those areas of potential conflict. Let us remember, we share the same interests in expanding mutually the commerce of the world. That when it comes to intellectual property, all countries need strong rules to protect innovation. And let me sketch out some areas where cooperation can be improved. Announcements to accelerate investment in renewable energy like solar power, where China leads, to speed up the transition to electric cars, where China also leads, to champion a massive expansion of tree planting and commit us to long-term aims for 2050 and 2060 of net carbon zero, have been made at COP26. And they are based on common but differentiated responsibilities. But the two make or break issues need us to work together from now. First, the richest countries must help developing countries address climate change. And I urge the richest countries, led by America and Europe, to make good their promise of 100 billion a year or 500 billion over 5 years to pay for mitigation, adaptation in the coast states, the vulnerable countries, and the developing world. But I also urge all countries that have yet to update their commitments to carbon reductions by 2030 to do so as soon as possible, so that we keep alive the commitment to keep temperatures at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Common approaches are not just needed to prevent a climate disaster in the future, but common approaches are needed to prevent the loss of thousands of lives from COVID now and in the next year or two. The containment of a disease, as we know, perhaps the purest example of global public goods. In a pandemic, no one anywhere is safe until everyone everywhere is safe. It's in every nation's interest to vaccinate everyone in every country and to avoid beggar thy neighbor policies that restrict the flow of vaccines or life-saving medical equipment across the world. Like climate change, the control of infectious disease is a global problem that requires a global solution. For think, and I conclude here, what we can achieve when we do work together. Smallpox was eradicated when we worked together. HIV/AIDS was brought under control by working together. Polio is on the way out across the world because we do work together. The ozone layer was addressed when we came together. The debt relief was provided to Africa in 2005 when we had an agreement together. Cooperation was achieved to prevent an economic collapse in 2009 when we worked together. The Paris Treaty of 2015, in which China played a remarkable part alongside America, was achieved because people decided to work together. All of which gives us hope for the future. And we need hope. It is said you can survive for 40 days without food, 8 days without water, 8 minutes without air, but not for 1 second without hope. Sending out a message that we will now attempt to work together to agree global responses to global problems and discover what we can do by working in common is what I believe will give people what they need most, and that is hope. Thank you.